But Brazil was mainly Marxist and Cepal. But when came the coup and all the ideas about the relationship, the positive, inevitable, inexorable relationship between economic development and political development was broken by the policy of the military, it was clear that we are orphans. So how to explain the economic miracle, the distributive bias, in favor of just middle classes, and to explain explain really how Brazil was doing very well and so on. So we had to take stances on this issue. So I think that there is another element which I think is important in the lineage you somehow represent or have already surpassed, and that is the importance of ideas, the role of ideas in terms of policy choices, and for us in terms of favors, really to predict how policy making fares and should fare. So I leave to you now. If you prefer to stand, that's the choice.
Thanks very much, Lourdes. I appreciate very much this invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to be here because it was really 25 years ago, as you said, that I made my first trip to this city, and we had gone to Buenos Aires first. And I remember at that IPSA meeting that the keynote speaker was none other than your Fernando Enrico Cardoso, when he was still in his identity as a major social science theorist long before he became your president. And I remember very vividly his keynote address in this enormous auditorium, and it was completely packed. There was not an empty seat, and I thought that was very interesting that he was packed not for his role as president of Brazil, but because of his prominence as a social scientist. So it's interesting to be here, and the engagement with you and your group was interesting because it got me thinking even more about Latin America in a global context. And I think that this meeting about what happened North-South in the context of the Great Recession is a wonderful frame, because Brazil strikes me as one of the countries that is responsible for breaking up the concept of North-South. I think it's rendering the North-South distinction as not very meaningful anymore. And so I'd like to, my comment is going to be a reflection on that. In the airplane here, I was reading an essay in the Financial Times which talked about how when Lehman Brothers was in the process of failing, and several of these banks were failing in the United States, that when they started to try to figure out what were the assets they had, what would be the size of the bailout that was needed. And this is a very important issue for the regulators about whether to try to bail them out. It turned out that nobody actually had a very good account of what was in their debt book, because the material was gathered in such a way that it was impossible to keep track of it. And the theme of this article was that nobody really has a very good idea. Well, I thought that's really, and so now there's a debate going on about whether there should be more regulatory at the national level, the international level. Do we need to have some more systematic way of figuring out what assets banks are holding, so that we have an idea about what their risk is, so that we have an idea about when we talk about the discussion of too big to fail. This is one of the big regulatory debates going on. Should we have a regulatory debate that prevents too big to fail? Well, to have such an idea, you have to know the degree of the risk. To know the degree of the risk, you have to know what the assets are. But in order to keep track of the assets, you need regulations that would define them. And that opens up the whole can of worms about how much regulation you're going to have. And of course, the banks don't want to have to share information. But on the other hand, they do want to be bailed out. So I think when I read this, I thought, this is the contradiction. This fits extremely well. This topic, our topic, because it strikes me as a battle between thinking at the level of the system and thinking at what the thinking of the system requires that we have very great information about the units at the bottom. And there's a tremendous tension between these two things. And so I want to explore that tension, because I see that the whole concept of North-South operates at the level of big aggregations, which make very little attention to the nature of the units are at the bottom. And that's the type of thinking which I think we're now in trouble with. And so I want to explore a bunch of these dichotomies that we use all the time and show how this crisis is causing trouble with them, and then maybe at the end speculate about where that leaves us in social science, if not in policy. The sections I want to unpack north-south, which then leads one to have to think about what dependencia means, and it also leads us to have to think of what's Washington consensus. I'm going to say, to me, Washington and the consensus dependencia are oddly similar. Micro versus macro, sovereignty versus crossing the border, international versus domestic, the money economy versus the real economy, democratic versus authoritarian, anarchy and hierarchy, pluralism and structuralism. These are categories that we've been using for many, many years, and I think that this crisis causes problems with all of them. And it's an interconnected bunch of problems because it has to do with the variety that actually takes place within systems, how much variety units have had. So let me start at the beginning and see how far I can get. Well, the first of these has to do with what is north-south of the distinction. North-south as a distinction arose at a time when the major preoccupation of the South was how oppressed it was by the North. This really had to do with an asymmetry of power and power realities. And the South is saying, you're ignoring us, you're not paying attention to us, you're running a system which oppresses us. And so what's interesting is how much the South, countries of the South, the BRICS, more or less that's generalized, but mostly in the South, the growth of the BRICS, I think, causes a challenge to all of those relationships. And I think that what it does is that it has broken up this two system determinisms, I think. One of them was global system determinism A. I would say that was dependencia, which was that what happens to you depended upon your position in a global system, and that where you are in the global system traps you, and that there's nothing you can do to get out of it. And well, I think that the rise of East Asia initially was what started to break that up. When I used to go to meetings, it was very clear that people started to have more and more trouble with that because it was very hard to understand why countries from the periphery were actually doing pretty well and emerged out of the periphery with that set of ideas. So I think that the East Asian mix famously did that. And I remember quite easily back in that era when we first met, it was interesting as how different the discourse was. You could talk about the growth of the East Asian mix, but not Latin America. Latin America was hopeless. And I remember that there were discussions, meetings. We started to have conferences where East Asian experts in Latin America, because Latin America has been very angry at this kind of unfair and vicious comparison. That was very interesting, emotional reaction there. But I think that generally what it all stretches was that what that all implies that countries have choices. Actually, that where you are in the system doesn't fully determine what you do. You have countries have choices, and there are a variety of strategies that countries can pursue that actually alter their relationship to the world economy and the international system. So I think that, and I want to talk about in a minute the discussion of what is it that countries did, and that became a very interesting debate, which remains very alive today. What are the strategies available to countries of what to do in their position in the world economy? So I think that undermined this, the dependencia, and undermined North-South, but I think the other kind of determinism that it undermined, I think, is the Washington Consensus. So we don't normally think of dependencia and the Washington Consensus as in a similar category because they are articulated that people who normally never talk to each other, don't know each other, and hate each other. But they are, strikes me as remarkably similar because the Washington Consensus is very familiar to all of you. It simply strikes me as a particular kind of determinism, which is that all countries must follow a neoliberal path of development, that what you have to do is incentivize individuals and markets to do very well. And if you do that, all you have to do is get some general macro correct policies and everything will follow and everything will be okay. Well, that's its own kind of determinism, which strikes me as a kind of a system determinism, which is one, again, it's another one size fits all. Everybody's the same. There is no such thing as there's no national economy if you don't study Chinese economics or Brazilian economics. I remember vividly in my job